And go ahead and grab a seat. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors within SMCC more broadly, although typically I spend most of my time up north in the Salt Lake area, but man, it is always so much fun to get to come down and spend a weekend with you all here in St. George. So let me just say this. If you are brand new, if this is your first Sunday here, just want to say thank you so much for trusting us with your willingness to come on out and spend a chunk of your morning. I know for some people, checking out a new church is kind of a small thing, doesn't seem like that may be difficult, but for some of us, that could be a difficult, a scary, a huge next step to take. And so if that's you, I just want to say thank you so much for trusting us with a portion of your morning. And I've done something wrong with my mic here, and I'm trying to correct my mistakes. I think that's better. What's that? Okay. All right, I think that's better. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, so so if you're new, thank you for trusting us. And if you're not new, if you have been here for a long time, just want to say thank you so much for trusting SMCC as the church, as the community of faith that you call home. I know that's not something that we take lightly, and so just want to thank you for that this morning. And beyond that, along those lines, what I'd like to talk about this morning together is the subject of trustability. And if you're wondering if that is a made-up word, yes, it is, and I'd like to give you its made-up definition. So trustability is this. It's the link between trust and capability. That trustability is the link between trust and capability. We've been in the middle of this series right now called Trust Issues, where the past 2 weeks we've been exploring how trust is really the oxygen of life. Relationally, it's what gives us the ability to breathe. And the reason we're delving into it is because trust is so central to life and relationships, and a lot of us have difficulty. We have challenges when it comes to trust. And what that means is if we have an inability to trust other people, then what that means is relationally, it's almost as if we can't breathe, that there's an inability to be at rest, to be at ease, to be at peace in the relationships that we have. And that can push us into kind of this state of life that is incredibly tense, that's anxious, that is pressured, that is stressful. And yet at the same time, chances are, if we have difficulty trusting, what got us there in the first place is we made the decision to trust someone or something only to be burned. And we don't want that to happen again. And so we're taking these 5 weeks to really break down what trust is so that we can understand how to grow in our ability to trust and how to know when is it safe to trust and when is it not, so that we can walk more and more in the life that Jesus invites us into, which is a life where we have the ability to be relaxed and at ease and at peace in our relationships with God, with others, and with church. And so that being said, we're going to continue along with that. We're breaking down trust with its 5 different components. And so far, this is what we've seen. These are the 5 parts of trust, that there's understanding and intent. That's what we covered weeks 1 and 2, that basically when someone demonstrates the desire and the capacity to know you, to understand you, to know what life is like for you, that fosters trust with that person. And when you get a sense that their motivation is for your good, for your benefit, that also fosters trust. But that is not the entire picture. And today what we're talking about is ability specifically. So just to kind of draw this out, let's imagine that you have a toothache, which I know is not something anyone wants to imagine ever, right? That let's say you're out for a nice dinner, maybe you're at Rigotti's having some of that bread and you're enjoying yourself, and then all of a sudden one of your teeth starts to hurt really badly. And you're like, oh man, I think I've got a toothache. I hope it goes away. It doesn't go away. A week later, it still hurts. It's throbbing. It's in pain. So you call up a dentist and you make an appointment and you get in, and the dentist is looking at your teeth, and let's just say that he looks at it and he's like, yeah, definitely something wrong with this one right here. Man, that's so frustrating. I know it's awful to move through life with tooth pain. I'm so sorry that this is what you've been going through. He demonstrates understanding. That fosters trust. And then he says, I want to get this fixed up for you so that way you can get back to life. You don't have this bothering you. He demonstrates his intent. His motivation is for you. And all this is beginning to build trust. Now imagine that this appointment takes a sudden right turn, and all of a sudden he pulls up a screen and it's like, all right, now let me just look this up on YouTube. I've never actually done this procedure before, but I've always wanted to. And then he begins to pull out drills and saws that are spinning and shiny and sharp. And in that moment, all trust would be gone, because you would feel that this person does not have the ability to come through in this specific scenario. And so that's what we're talking about today. That ability is also one of the most significant pieces, that building blocks that really go into our ability to trust someone. And so ability, we could look at it like this, that ability is the capacity to deliver on a specific need. That ability is the capacity to deliver in a particular context in a certain way that if there is a need, this person can come through on that need. Now, in the book, Trust by Henry Cloud, that really has informed a lot of this series, he says this about this. He says that people make big trust decisions. They make the decision to trust people in really significant ways because they already trust someone in many other ways, in many other capacities. They trust someone here, and so they make the assumption that I can trust them here also. And so the person is caring over here. They're honest. They work hard. They've got good values. And they're understanding. And they're pure-hearted, smart, creative. Usually they really like the person. And so they're already close friends or have had great experiences with them. And these dynamics also make them trust the person. Again, the assumption is because I trust them here and I like them here, that I can also trust them here. But this is a mistake. Because the person doesn't have the ability needed to be trusted, at least not in the specific way or context in which they are about to be trusted. And I think this can happen in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different relationships or partnerships that we move into in business. When you make a decision to hire a friend because you enjoy spending time with them and they're great friends, then all of a sudden they're in the business and you find out that they're awful coworkers. They're far better friends than they are employees. Or sometimes, the movie that always comes to mind when I think of this is the movie Ocean's 11, where you've got George Clooney and Julia Roberts right there, a divorced couple. Clooney's trying to get her back, but she's got a new boo or beau, depending on your generation. She's got a new man in her life, and essentially, George Clooney's asking her about this, and he asks her the question, does he make you laugh? And she snaps back immediately, he doesn't make me cry. Sticking it to him, essentially, about the pain that ended their first marriage, the first relationship. And in a way, what she's calling him out on is that I trusted you to come through in a specific way as my spouse, as my husband, and you failed to do that. And I think a lot of times that can happen when someone is charming and they're fun to be around, and we trust them in this particular way to foster a relationship, and then all of a sudden we make a big decision to trust them in another way that doesn't necessarily always work out well. Now, no spoiler alert here. Well, it is a spoiler alert, but the movie's been out like 20 years, so that's on you. But I won't spoil it. You'll have to just go watch it. It's good. But this happens. We make big trust decisions oftentimes without considering whether or not someone actually has the ability to come through in this particular way. And so when it comes to this third facet of trust, it's worth it to look for trustworthiness, to look for proof of trustworthiness before trusting. It's worth it to look for evidence that the person has an ability to come through in this particular way, that they have the capacity to meet this specific need. And the interesting thing is we actually see Jesus demonstrating even this understanding within his ministry and his relationship specifically with his disciples. So this is John 14:11. We see this take place here where it's the upper room, basically the final night of Jesus' life. In the morning, actually in the night, he gets arrested. And in the morning, he gets convicted, and then he gets crucified. And he dies the following day. So this is his last evening with the disciples. And he's stressing to them some of the most important things. And he says this, John 14:11. He says, believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, stressing the unity between him and the Father, saying that essentially I am God, first and second person of the Trinity, that I am the Father is in me. We are one. He's saying, I want you to understand this. And then he says, or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves, pointing to the miracles that he himself had performed throughout the ministry that they were firsthand eyewitnesses to throughout the 3 years that they had spent with him. He's saying that these supernatural occurrences that you have been eyewitnesses to are in a sense the proof of the capacity that I have to tell you the truth about things concerning who I am and who God is. And so we see Jesus demonstrating this understanding. And so again, within this series, one of the things we've been talking about is trust in 3 different areas, with God, with others, and with church. And so I think when we take this capacity and we break it down in those 3 contexts, the question that it's worth considering is there proof that God can be trusted? Is there proof that they can be trusted in whatever context we're talking about? And is there proof that this church, this organization can be trusted? That is a significant question to ask and to consider when we're on the verge of making a big trust decision. And so with that, when we get to the end of our time together, I want to walk through this in kind of, those three different categories of God, church, God, others, and church. But for kind of the bulk of our talk here today, what I want to do is focus in on one of those areas in specifically. I want to focus on really God, the question of, does God have the ability that we need God to have in order for us to trust him? And I know that's even kind of an odd way to phrase the question, but I think it gets at something kind of interesting. On the one hand, you could pose the question like this: what proof would be necessary for you to know that God is worth trusting? What evidence could God provide that would lead you to an understanding that God is safe to trust? And actually, in order to answer that question, you have to kind of dig beneath the surface even a little bit further and ask the question, well, what am I trusting God for? Right, if I need to know God's ability to be trusted, I need to know what exactly it is that I'm considering trusting God for. And if I was to just kind of throw something out off the, I think as an answer to that, we could spend all day on that particular question and that subject, but I think I'd say this, that there's three things that are especially relevant. Right, that chaos would be one, death would be another, and then a satisfaction in life would be the third. And so chaos, I think every single one of us at one point, we've been through seasons in our life that have been marked far more by chaos than they have by peace and order and direction. And in the midst of a season like that, having an anchoring trust in God is a huge thing for a person to be able to cling to. And so chaos is something that is significant here. The second one would be death. The unfortunate reality is that every single one of us at some point will experience death. That death is something that every single one of us will enter into. And in the midst of that, an anchoring trust in God is a very significant thing for a person to have. And then third and finally, satisfaction. I think that every single one of us, there's a desire for a way of life that is satisfying, whether it's significant, whether it's secure, but a life that is in some ways satisfying. And yet so often we experience a difficulty in this life in locating exactly how do we find the satisfaction that nags at us, that is this persistent kind of internal nagging. How do we find and locate that? And I think these three areas become especially central places where a trust in God becomes particularly relevant. And so again, the question is, in these three areas of chaos and death and a need for significance and satisfaction, can we trust God? Or even what proof could God provide to us that he is worth trusting in these areas? And so that's what I want to kind of explore together over the chunk of our time, kind of the bulk of our time together, and then we'll round it out with all three of those. So with that, what I wanted to say is that I think the best evidence that God could provide is the best evidence for a God who acts must be supernatural acts of God. The best evidence for a God who acts and who is therefore able to be trusted in these specific areas is a God who acts. And if God is acting, God being the creator and sustainer of all things, actually outside of the nature that he brought into being, then his actions would be supernatural. And so that would be the evidence, the proof that is necessary for us to know that God is worth trusting. So what I want to do is walk through this in four different ways. And we'll skim through kind of the third one, but these are the four proofs for God that are supernatural in nature. So we've got cosmology, we have miracles, we have resurrection, specifically the resurrection of Jesus, and then fourth and finally, prophecy. So these are the four areas that we'll walk through together in exploring the evidence that God has offered to allow us to see his capacity and that he's worth trusting in these particular ways. So that's where we're going this morning. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the first one, cosmology. So cosmology is the study of the origins of the universe, the study of how space, time, and matter, all of it collectively came into being. How did these things start? And there's really two different camps when it comes to cosmology. The one is to say that there was no start, that there was no beginning, so there is no need for a beginner. To put it like this, Bertrand Russell says this, that the universe is just there and that's all. And for significant chunks of history, this was actually the way of understanding how the world worked, how the universe is and existed, that there was no moment at which it came into being, that it always existed and has always been. And yet, so much of the work that has taken place over the past century and couple of centuries has led to this conviction as put by the famed physicist and cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin. He says that Scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. That there was a beginning, which necessitates that there was a beginner. And some of the things that point to this are just the reality that the universe continues to expand, and as it does, it continues to cool. That the temperature that marks the universe overall continues to drop. And if the universe was eternal, if it wasn't just really old, kind of stretching back on the timeline a long ways, but if it's eternal, going back in this direction endlessly, then what this trend signifies to us is that essentially the temperature within the expanding universe would have already dropped to such a degree that life itself would have become impossible. Something physicists call heat death would have occurred. And so you and I wouldn't even be here. So the very fact that we are here, that there is heat enough for us to be alive, is an indication that the universe is not eternal, but that it had a beginning. And even beyond that, when you see the fine-tuning, that there is a design that gives the possibility of our life, that is an indication that where we see a design, there was a designer. And so when you look into cosmology and the beginnings of the universe, what it indicates is that there was someone who brought all these things into being in a very particular way to bring about the possibility of our lives and our relationships, not just with each other, but perhaps even with the one who brought this all into being in the first place. And that's actually what we see in several places throughout the biblical writings. Just to point to one of them, this is Psalm 33. The book of Psalms is a collection of really poems in the Old Testament that are prayers. And so Psalm 33 says this in sort of the middle section of it. It says, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth." Speaking to God's creative act and bringing all things into being. Verse 7, "He gathers the waters of the sea into jars. He puts the deep into storehouses," speaking to God's sustaining work, that he didn't just bring all things into being, but continues to hold all things together as well. Verse 8, "Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the people of the world revere him. For he spoke and it came to be. He commanded and it stood firm." And so there we have, in essence, a supernatural act, because if nature was brought into being with the act of creation, then anything that acted before that is something that is beyond or above nature, that is supernatural. And so, there we have with cosmology, something that points to the existence of a God who created and sustains all things, and for that reason has the capacity to be trusted. All right, so that's the first one. Now, the second one is miracles, and this one is fun in some ways. So I think in kind of our modern worldview, a lot of times people will take two things, miracles and science, and hold them up together in sort of an antagonistic relationship between each other, that basically they're against each other, that they don't coexist. They're like two family members who can't be at the same Thanksgiving, right? They don't like each other. And so some people will even say that science has disproven miracles, that maybe back in the day, before they had a scientific understanding, before they had a modern worldview and understood natural causes, before they got all of that, of course people believed in miracles because they were gullible and they just didn't get it. And I think I do find it a little bit ironic that people who will dismiss miracles on the basis of this reasoning also tend to be the very same people who love to dabble in conspiracy theories. There's a little bit of irony in that for me personally, or conspiracy truth, depending on where you're coming from this morning. But we'll say this, that science, the work of science is actually to study natural causes. And in that regard, I think we can actually see science and miracles as far more complementary in nature rather than antagonistic, because science gives us an understanding of how the natural world actually works. Because it's only when you understand that it's impossible for a human to walk on water that when you see it occurring, you understand that this is unnatural, this is supernatural, this is a miracle. And so, in a sense, science actually bolsters our appreciation and understanding of the significance of miracles, because it leads us to see that something is occurring here that is not happening according to the natural rules of nature, but there is something circumventing them here, and that is intended to draw our attention and perhaps even to reveal something that's occurring here. And that's actually what we see when we look back at the New Testament writings. For example, John, who was one of the closest friends of Jesus, one of his disciples throughout his ministry, John writes this about the miracles in John chapter 2. He writes this about one specific miracle when he says, John 2:11, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So this is referring to the moment where Jesus is at this wedding. It's a week-long celebration. They run out of wine. It's this horrible social kind of catastrophe, and his mom comes to him and asks him basically, can he do something? And so he turns the water into wine. And John indicates that this is a sign, which is a significant word all throughout the book or the Gospel of John, that a sign is something that is a signal or a pointer of a deeper reality, that it's revealing something. And here we see that the sign is revealing Jesus' glory, his deity, that he is God. And when you break it down a little bit further, part of how we understand that is that God is the creator of all things and the sustainer of all things. And that means that God is actually the one who designed the process by which water is made into wine through grapes and fermentation on an annual basis every single year. And so if God is the one who designed the process by which this occurs and has occurred for thousands of years, then how difficult would it be for that very same God to circumvent the process and go from step A to step Z in a single moment, which is exactly what Jesus does here. And so it's revealing that he is the one who created the process to begin with. And so, in that regard, miracles as well, they point to not just the capacity of God and really the existence and the ability of God to be trusted, but they even narrow the focus down to that Jesus himself is the one who has the capacity to reveal to us who God is and that he himself is God himself. And I think perhaps the most significant miracle would be the one that he achieved on the other side of the cross, in rising back to life, in victory over death, not just to live for another extra couple of weeks or years or decades, but never to be touched by death again. And typically, of all of the arguments, this is the one that we usually spend the most time on. So I'm going to kind of skim the surface on it, but let's just suffice it to say this, that if he is the author of all life to begin with, then how difficult would it be for him to overcome death? And so resurrection is the third one. Now, the fourth and final one, and then we'll kind of step out of what you might call the classroom this morning, would be prophecy. So prophecy is, you can understand prophecy in this way. It's a way to verify supernatural claims. Now, not all prophetic writings, not all prophecy in the Bible is future-oriented or forth-telling things that are to be. It's not all that. Sometimes we kind of put it all in that category. But the truth is that there is a good amount of that within the biblical writings. By some counts, there's roughly 1,100 prophecies that take place from the Old Testament that we then see fulfilled in the New Testament. And just to kind of make this graphically, to represent it visually, this is a graphic of this, where you see on the left-hand side, you have the Old Testament writings, the prophecies, and then connecting to the record in the New Testament of the fulfillment of that prophecy. And so roughly 1,100 prophecies that we see made in the Old Testament and fulfilled in the New Testament, which is just incredible, especially when you delve a little bit into some of the probabilities surrounding these things. So even if we just narrow our focus down to one of these particular categories, let's say the cross, that there are about 48, there's 48 prophecies that are made concerning Jesus' death on the cross. And you consider the probability of not just one of those, but all of them coming true within one person, the probabilities begin to be a little bit astounding. So just to break this down a little bit, you could say this, that in my own life, the odds that I am going to watch a movie on any particular day are probably about 1 in 5. I don't know if that about 1 in 5. I don't know if that's above or beyond where you're at, but so about 1 out of every 5 days, I'm probably going to watch a movie. Now, when it comes to a haircut, I probably get my haircut about once every 6 or 7, about 7, 8 weeks, somewhere around there. So you could say the odds of any particular day that I'm going to get my haircut is about 1 in 50. About 1 in 50. So when you're calculating the probability of whether or not two things will happen, not just independently, but in sequence together, perhaps even at the same time, you have to calculate the probabilities against each other, that you multiply them. So if we've got 1 in 5 versus 1 in 50, in order to calculate the odds of me getting my hair cut and watching a movie on the same day, you have to multiply them together. And what you find is that it's actually 1 in 250. So basically, you've got a 20% chance I'm going to watch a movie. You've got a 2% chance I'm going to get my hair cut. And I don't even know how to do the math on what the odds are of them happening on the same day, but it's drastically reduced, 1 in 250. And those are two things that actually happen pretty frequently within my life. And so when you take that process and you then transfer it over to these prophecies about the cross, the probabilities become astounding, because these are prophecies that were made at minimum 500 years prior to the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. For example, take Isaiah chapter 53, where you've got this suffering servant song that is all about this person who is going to be pierced for our iniquities, for our transgressions. And yet at the end of the poem, you see the person alive again, that this person is going to die sacrificially on behalf of others and then be alive somehow again, which indicates resurrection. This was written some 600 years prior to Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And then if you go back to Genesis 3, where you see what is called the proto-evangelion, the first instance of, the first prophecy really pointing to the seed of the woman. One of her descendants will crush the head of the snake, really our enemy, and he will strike his heel. Again, a prophecy pointing to the death of Jesus as a descendant of Eve, who will essentially vanquish, will crush our enemy, but be injured in the midst of that, will die in the midst of that. Again, the probability of any one of these actually coming true is insane, and yet when you begin to calculate them together, the numbers become astounding. And yet, what we find is that they all actually occurred. Right? Within the life of Jesus, within his death on the cross, he fulfilled all 48 of these prophecies. And so again, the numbers are beyond me. I don't even know how to break it down in that particular way, but I think what it leads us to understand is that when you see so many of these prophecies being made throughout these biblical writings, it's not like someone just, wrote this book and this chapter and made the prophecies, and then they wrote this chapter and fulfilled the prophecies, because this is a collection of 66 books written over 1,500 years by over 40 different authors in several different languages, and yet you still see these connections all fitting into one storyline. That is an indication that perhaps the person of Jesus is far more than just an impressive actor on the world's stage. But even in addition to that, he is the director, he is the scriptwriter, he is the stage designer, he's the original author, he is the inventor of theater altogether. To put it in theological terms, he is sovereign. And that's what we see when we take all of these things together. When you look at the prophecy, when you look at his resurrection, when you look at the miracles, and when you look at cosmology, what you see is that there is a God who brought all things into being, and that Jesus is the one who has revealed that God to us, because Jesus is, in fact, the one who is that God. And so he is sovereign, which is basically a fancy theological way of saying what you get when you put together him being all knowing and all powerful and the creator and the sustainer of all things, that he is free and at ease to do as he pleases. And so he has the ability or the capacity to be trusted, especially when you pair it with parts 1 and 2 of trust, that his desire is to connect with us and that he understands you, he sees you, he hears you, he knows you even better than you know yourself, and what he wants for you is life. And so I get that was probably a little bit heady, and what I want to do now is we kind of come closer to the end of our time. What I want to do is take it kind of out of the realm of arguments and actually look at just an account we see of Jesus where he's interacting with a woman, and we see some of these same things demonstrated. And so this is the story from John chapter 4, the woman at the well, story we've been referencing throughout this series. And what we see here is that Jesus demonstrates his capacity in the conversation with this woman in order to foster greater trust with her. And so this is kind of the context, that there's this Samaritan woman who is going to this well in the middle of the day at noon, at the hottest part of the day, in the midst of a part of the world that is very hot to begin with. And there's a reason she's doing this, right? All the other women, they go to the well in the morning, in the cool of the day, to gather their water then, and yet she waits, intentionally does not go then, and instead makes the journey at noon, at the hottest part of the day, because she knows that that is the time that she is least likely to encounter anyone else there, because this is a person who has experienced an extreme amount of shame and condemnation from the community that she belongs to. And so she's not interested in going at the same time as everyone else and receiving these judgmental looks and glances and comments. She's not interested in experiencing further shame and condemnation. So she goes at noon, hoping that there will be no one else there. And yet on this particular day, what she finds is that she's not alone. But there's this random Jewish man who is sitting against the well. And as she goes to draw water, he has the audacity to ask her for a drink, because one of the things we know about first century Israel is that there was this intense ethnic animosity that existed between Jewish people and the Samaritan people, where they did not even talk to each other. Jewish people actually would take a longer route to go around Samaria to avoid going through. And yet Jesus intentionally goes through Samaria and plants himself at this well, so he has the opportunity to connect with this woman. And so he asks her for a drink, and she calls him out and saying, "You shouldn't even be here to begin with, and now you have the audacity to speak to me. This is breaking so many social norms and codes and rules." And yet Jesus, he responds to her by saying this. So picking it up with the narrative, John chapter 4, verse 10, Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." Now, living water is an important phrase. We actually see it a couple of times in the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament, and in both cases, it's in direct reference to God, that God himself is said to be living water. And so, in a sense here, what Jesus is saying is that I have the capacity to give you living water. I have the capacity to give you, in a sense, God, or a relationship with God that brings you life in a way that is satisfying, that is as satisfying as a glass of water is on an incredibly hot day. "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water?" I think in a sense, she doesn't believe him, right? She's skeptical. Maybe she's got some trust issues herself. I think it's pretty safe to say that she's been burned. And so she's basically saying, what are you talking about? And then she challenges him here, saying, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" The interesting thing is the people of Israel, Jewish people and the Samaritans, actually had some common ancestry, Jacob being one of them. And the woman is saying, "Are you calling yourself greater than Jacob?" which is something that no Jewish person would have done. And yet Jesus responds by saying this. Verse 13, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." He's saying that I have the capacity to give you this living water, to give you a relationship with God that takes up residence within you in a way that is incredibly satisfying and that wells up even to eternal life. I have the ability, the capacity to give you this. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." Either she doesn't get it or she's just continuing to be skeptical and suspicious. I think it's the latter myself. And so then Jesus says to her in verse 16, he demonstrates his sovereignty here, his knowledge about her, his understanding of her in a way that leads her to grasp his ability to provide on what he's offering. This is the conversation. He says to her, "Go call your husband and come back." And immediately you can almost see her pausing in the middle of the conversation. All of a sudden the emotions are heightened, the tension is present, that everything has shifted with this one phrase, with this one sentence. Verse 17, she responds saying, "I have no husband." And then Jesus takes it not one step further, but like 17 steps further. And he says to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." Immediately, he diagnoses really what the heart, what the core of her shame is, and the reason why she has faced so much condemnation from this community that she's coming out to the well at the hottest part of the day. He's calling out what is probably one of the most painful aspects of her life, something that has left her isolated and ashamed and alone, and he's demonstrating his knowledge, his understanding of where she is. And yet he's doing so in the context of a conversation where he's already shown that he is not against her, but that he's for her. And so with this understanding, he's not offering further condemnation or further shame. He's telling her, "I see you, I understand you, I know what you're going through, and I have something better for you, and I have the capacity to deliver it." And she responds in verse 19 saying, "Sir, I can see that you are a prophet," recognizing what he's offered. And then she essentially, I think, deflects the attention off of herself, because this has got to be an incredibly uncomfortable thing. And she moves it into a theological question. "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." And the conversation continues from there, and Jesus continues to unfold things in such a way that leads her to really placing trust in a relationship with him and recognizing that he is not just a prophet, but that he himself is something far, far more. And the conversation actually ends like this. What we see is that in verse 28, leaving her water jar, forgetting even the reason that she came there in the first place, the woman went back to the town, back to the people who had rejected her, back to the people that she had been isolated from. She goes to them and says to them, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah, the Savior, the Anointed One?" And they came out of the town and made their way toward him. And what we end up seeing is that Jesus' interaction with her and the story that she walks away with actually becomes something that fosters trust, not just for the woman with Jesus, but for the entire town with Jesus. And thankfully, the story was written and recorded so that it might do the very same thing for you and for me. That this exchange was done not just for them, but for us. But at the end of the day, I think this is what we see, that Jesus' sovereignty is proof of capacity that leads us to trust him for all eternity. Jesus' sovereignty is proof of capacity that leads us to trust him for all of eternity, that he is able to be trusted. So just kind of peppering through all 3 of those categories, with God, with others, with church, real quickly as we kind of bring this to a close. I think with God, what we see is that God has delivered on our specific needs for sovereignty, victory, and glory. And these correspond to chaos, death, and a need for a satisfying and a significant life. That if Jesus is sovereign, if he's not just an impressive actor, but if he is all of the rest of it as well, the scriptwriter, the director, and all of it, then we have the ability to have an anchoring trust in him, not just in the midst of seasons that are good and fine, but in the midst of seasons that are marked by chaos as well. And if he is the one who has risen in victory over death, and he is the author of life to begin with, then we can trust him as we know that death is something that we will face as well. And even beyond that, when it comes to glory, in essence, what we find is that the most satisfying and significant life that we can find is in relationship with the one who created and sustains all things, with the one who is glorious, with the one who has a desire to connect with us and who understands us, who offers us the living water that can quench the thirst that we have for a satisfying and a significant life. And so Jesus has the capacity to be trusted. All right, now with others, this is what we see, that because ability can grow, we might withhold it now, but offer it later after proof of growth. Just because someone doesn't demonstrate the ability to be trusted in this specific area now doesn't mean that they won't develop the capacity. And so it's worth kind of holding out that. But at the same time, before we make big trust decisions in our lives, it's worth it to consider, does this person have the ability to come through in this particular way? Just because I trust them here, just because I like them here, that does not mean that they have the ability to meet this need here. And so it's worth considering that question. And then third and finally, with church. Before trusting a church, look for proof of delivering on our specific needs for biblical teaching, equipping, reaching, and leading. The truth is, there's so much more that we could say about whether or not a church has the ability to be trusted. But I think at its base essence, does a church have the capacity, the ability to deliver biblical teaching that is hopeful, that is helpful, that is understandable, that is clear? Beyond that, does it have a leadership culture of transparency and accountability? I think that's a massive thing when it comes to knowing whether or not you can trust a church. And so all of that is significant. But the bottom line is, trust accordingly based on ability, because ability is a massive piece of trust. And grow in the ability to be trusted by others accordingly. Because as we increase our capacity to come through in specific ways, it increases the ability of others to trust us also. And so, at the end of the day, what I hope we're walking away seeing is that Jesus, in several ways, has demonstrated his capacity to be trusted in the midst of whatever it is that you might be in now. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we thank you for the time together this morning. Thank you for so many of the different ways that you have demonstrated your capacity, that you've shown us your sovereignty, that you have shown us your ability to come through in the midst of all of the situations and the circumstances that face us in this life. And thank you also that you haven't left us lost regarding what you've invited us to trust you with. But that when it comes to the chaos of this life, when it comes to the reality of death, when it comes to our need for a satisfying and a significant life, when it comes to our inner spiritual thirst for more, that you have the capacity and the desire to connect with us and to meet our needs in every single one of these areas. And for that, we thank you and we praise you this morning.